Bonjour à tous, welcome everyone. So on behalf of the Glendon Center for Research on Language and Culture Contact, but also on behalf of the Canadian Language Museum, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a day which is intended for us all to pause and reflect. Reflect on the trauma caused by the residential school system, but also reflect on reconciliation in action at York, at Glendon, and in the Canadian post-secondary system, and of course, on Indigenous language policy. But before we start, I would like to invite Glendon Principal Marco Fiola to open this important event with our land acknowledgement. Marco?
Merci Sylvie. Annie, bonjour. Good afternoon, everyone. Comme nous ne sommes pas tous réunis en un même lieu, nous sommes conscients que cette reconnaissance des territoires ne s'applique peut-être pas au territoire sur lequel vous vous trouvez actuellement. Si c'est le cas, nous vous demandons de prendre la responsabilité de reconnaître le territoire traditionnel sur lequel vous vous trouvez et les titulaires du traité. Nous reconnaissons que de nombreuses nations autochtones ont, avec les territoires sur lesquels les campus de l'Université York sont situés, des relations de longue date qui précèdent l'établissement de l'Université York. Glendon, en tant que partie intégrante de l'Université York, reconnaît sa présence sur le territoire traditionnel de nombreuses nations autochtones. La région connue comme Toronto a été préservée par la nation Anishinaabe, la Confédération Haudenosaunee et les Hurons-Wendat. Elle est désormais le foyer d'un grand nombre de communautés autochtones, inuits et métisses. Nous reconnaissons les titulaires actuels du traité, la Première Nation des Mississauga de Credit. Ce territoire est soumis au traité de la ceinture Wampum, aussi connu sous le nom Dish with One Spool ou Gamelle à une Miquenne, une entente définissant le partage et la préservation pacifique de la région des Grands Lacs. As we're not all gathered in the same space, we recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory you're currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and the current treaty holders. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. Glendon, as part of York University, acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Hurons-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lake regions. Miigwech.
Thank you, Principal Fiola, Miigwech, et merci d'être des nôtres aujourd'hui. Before we get started, I would like to bring everybody's attention to two exhibits presented by the Canadian Language Museum, located on the Glendon campus. So if you give me just 1 second, I'll share my screen and try to show you what I'm referring to. Just here. So, well, I'll start with this one, but I wanted to start with the other one. It's Speaking the Inuit Way. It's in the Glendon atrium, in the Centre d'Excellence for another week. And the other one, and of course I'm doing it wrong, there we go. It's Cree, the people's language, and it's on display in the Canadian Language Museum, which is open now and next month. So if you're on campus or if you intend to go next week, please drop by and Elaine will tell you all about those exhibitions. So I'm trying to stop my recording. There, my display, there we are. So, sans plus attendre, I would like now to leave the floor to Jean-Michel Montsion from the Glendon Canadian Studies Program, and he's also director of the Robarts Center for Canadian Studies. Jean-Michel will be monitoring this panel, and just in case you hadn't noticed at the back, he was already present when our three panelists drafted the Glendon Truth and Reconciliation Declaration 5 years ago. So, Jean-Michel, merci.
Merci Sylvie. Vous pouvez bien m'entendre? Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor to moderate this panel of great friends, wonderful people with great insights. Maya, Amos, and Ian. They all are going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. So we should have time after that for some questions. For your questions, we invite you to use the chat box, and please indicate clearly who the question is for so they can have a sense of the questions for them. And at the end, if there's time, they'll be able to answer some of them. Let me just introduce our speakers in case you don't know them. The first speaker will be Ian Martin, who is, among other things, a full-time faculty member in English at Glendon, and he will be speaking on the Glendon Truth and Reconciliation Declaration and its aftermath. We will then turn to Amos Key Jr., who's currently the Executive Director of CKRZ 100.3, Ohsweken Six Nation, and consultant for the Bachelor of Education for Teachers of Indigenous Languages at the First Nations Technical Institute on Tyendinega, Mohawk. And last but not least at all, Chacaby, who is a full-time faculty member in sociology at Glendon, among other things, will be presenting on the future of Anishinaabe. So I hope that you will enjoy. And so without further ado, Ian, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel. It's wonderful to be among the four of us who were friends in 2015, and I think we're still friends, and we're still following the same path that we started then. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got on that path and where we're going now. So 6 years ago, in December 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation final report burst into the consciousness of Canadians with its truth-telling about brutal colonial violence and the dispossession of Indigenous land and resources, and the assertion of European superiority in terms of civilization and, yes, even languages. It talked about the destructive and racist mindset on which Canada is grounded, and which remains a dark cloud that hangs over all of us and holds us back from the true humanity, respectful of the relationship that we should have, especially if we were to have a fair share of what the land has to offer and to share it with Indigenous originary peoples of the country. This is also International Translation Day, and I was reminded the other day by Ellen Gabriel in a meeting that I had around the United Nations Declaration and how to apply it to Canada. She said it's a great difficulty for people who look at a forest and see natural resources when the translation of the term natural resources in Mohawk comes out as all my relations. It would be a good opportunity, I think, for people to begin to have a mindset which moves from a mindset looking at the world as exclusively exploitable and available on the market versus a mindset which sees the world as all my relations. I think that the report didn't simply criticize Canada and its rootedness in colonialism. It also charted a course toward the possibility of achieving at some point in the future a Canadian version of, yes, decolonial humanity through its 94 calls to action, which we are commemorating today. And by the way, let's be honest, there isn't a single country in the hemisphere in which those harsh words would not apply. But not every country has had the privilege of having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, holding a mirror up to its population and asking its population to take its hands away from its face and to look in the mirror, to learn the truth, never taught in public schools or universities in the past, and asks them to start to listen to how to recover that relationship, which, by the way, involves recovering your humanity and your relationship to the land. Some of the calls to action were directed to governments, some to churches, some to educators, and many to Canadian universities, where the leaders of tomorrow are formed. Their message, those 94 calls to action, are for everyone to hear. Read the report, it said. Reflect on its meaning. Reflect on its meaning for you, and realize that you, alive at this moment in history and on this land, are being called to discover your responsibility. Find a call to action that resonates with you, which best suits your area of actionability. Read and reflect on that call. Find your mutuality with Indigenous peoples and translate that new sense of responsibility into action. Reconciliation. If you listen carefully, there is a call to action for you, which you can learn about. And if you're a member of the York community, there isn't a single York faculty that doesn't have a responsibility for a whole chunk of calls to action. The fact that this is the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation is a response to one of those calls to action. And it allows us to mark the day with reflection on the relationship and an assessment of what has been done and what enormous amount of work still needs to be done. The Glendon Declaration story has followed all these twists and turns, and this moment gives us a chance to speak out on what has been done and the enormous amount of what remains to be done if we are to carry out our responsibilities of listening, hearing, and acting. Here at Glendon, the four of us heard the TRC call to action, and we formed ourselves into a planning group and decided to choose 3 calls to action in the area of language and culture. Those calls were acknowledging that Indigenous rights set out in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution must include language rights. Number 2, introduce federal legislation to enact an Indigenous Language Act. And 3, appoint an Indigenous Language Commissioner. We decided we needed like-minded allies. You always need allies. And so we organized a national colloquium at Glendon on the implications for Indigenous language policy of the TRC report. 82 individuals from both First Nations and Inuit and settler and non-Indigenous scholars and activists attended a one-day colloquium co-sponsored by several Glendon entities, especially the GSPIA, the CRLCC, and the Canadian Language Museum. This event took place on February the 9th, 2016, so 5 years ago, and it was beautifully organized with tobacco for the guests and talking circles, and it was opened by former Grand Chief Phil Fontaine, without whom there would not be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The summer of 2016 was spent in writing up the notes taken and consulting with participants. And this activity resulted in the production of the document whose full title is, take a long breath, the Glendon Truth and Reconciliation Declaration on Indigenous Language Policy and Related Responsibilities of Post-Secondary Institutions. Yeah. The long and short versions, not of the title, but of the document, are available on the CRLCC website with translations of the short version, please, only the short version, in Anishinaabe, Mohawk, Inuktitut, and Inuinnaqtun. The declaration was directed to the federal government and others and says that to truly celebrate the 150th birthday of Canada in 2017, the Crown and her federal government must include, number 1, include Indigenous language rights in Section 35. 2, develop the Indigenous Language Act based on the 2005 Task Force report on Aboriginal languages and cultures, of which Amos was a significant member. 3, set up an office of the Commissioner of Official Languages with 3 commissioners, one of which for each of the national Indigenous groups. The Glendon Declaration was given a public launch in November 2016 on the occasion of an international conference organized by the CRLCC. And the news, the great news that happened was within 2 weeks of that conference, the federal government acted, with the Prime Minister in December 2016 announcing his government's intention to respond, interestingly, to the same 3 calls to action that the Glendon Declaration put forward. Now, it's somewhat of an urban myth that this document single-handedly led the government to declare within a month of the publication of the document its intention to bring in legislation. And like many myths, there is a grain of truth. 1 week prior to the launch, a delegation from the Glendon School of Public and International Affairs, led by Annie Demerjian and Francis Caron, allowed me and one of our graduate students, Katie Misak, to join them on their trip to Ottawa. They were planning to visit various ministries, but the most interesting ministry for me was the Indigenous Affairs Ministry. We had already sent copies of the declaration to the ministry, and we were very pleased when we were given over an hour with senior policy people and an assistant deputy minister, with the discussion almost completely focused on the declaration. We did our best to convince those officials that the calls to action were important, and especially important because they were time sensitive, since the last generation of fluent speakers of many Indigenous languages of Canada are going to pass soon. And it was important to support the connection between generations of fluent speakers and those who come after. Now, to the aftermath. The federal legislation took 3 long years to develop and was finally passed into law as Bill C-91 in the summer of 2019. Both Amos and I appeared before standing committees of the House and Senate, and we wrote a long position paper, which has been carefully archived. There's very little evidence that the government listened to any of the advice that they heard. And as you may know, it ended up with the Inuit declaring the law as one more piece of colonial legislation imposed on Indigenous people without their consent. So not a great track record for the first piece of legislation on Indigenous languages. So we, the 4 of us, decided to convene a second national colloquium, which was held here in December 2019, to assess the situation, quote unquote, in the wake of the bill. Although one of our visitors, Mike Turin from UBC, said, wake, I came to the conference because I thought we were going to have a wake to bury the damn bill. No, it was just in the wake of the bill. But you get the idea. It was notable for the presence of an Inuit delegation from Nunavut, headed up by the wonderful Aluki Kotyuk of Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, a powerful fighter for Indigenous language rights. I'm happy to say that the papers for the event, the Glendon Declaration, and the policy paper that Amos and I contributed are expected to be published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2022. Those assembled here in 2019 commented on weaknesses in all 3 parts of the bill. Weak statement of rights, confusing legislation, weak mandate of the commissioner. The main criticism is that it provided no defined language rights to Indigenous people. The Indigenous people have no more rights to language after the bill as they had before. And that's very disappointing. It's outrageous that Indigenous people still do not have the right to have their children educated in their own languages. And they do not have a remedy in the courts to compel that that right be respected. Without this right defined and guaranteed in law, the assimilative objective of the residential schools regime to separate children from their languages and civilization The new federal legislation, C-15, called the UNDRIP legislation, which seeks to bring the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, into contact with Canadian law. If that is done honorably, and this is where our advocacy work must be concentrated in the next 2 years, there could be a chance to read the earlier flawed bill with no defined rights in the context of the new bill, which defines rights. And therefore, we would be able to apply Article 14 of UNDRIP, which I must quote to you. It states that Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. The second source of hope is the United Nations Decade of Indigenous Languages, which begins in just 3 months' time. The decade invites countries and universities around the world, and I'm looking at you, York, to adopt locally relevant 10-year action plans to support Indigenous languages. This would include the development of degree programs in Indigenous languages and in revitalization of those languages. And these would answer, not incidentally, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call number 16. Such a plan has been brought forward at Glendon by Glendon's Indigenous Advisory Committee, modeled on similar action being taken at other universities. So this has been the short story of the Glendon TRC declaration and its aftermath. Hearing the call, accepting that the call was intended for us, gathering allies who also heard the call, taking initial action, and using our privileged connections to get in the room with policymakers. Thank you, GSPIA. Following up on that initial action, which failed to bring about systemic change, of course, continuing to seek every possible opportunity to expand the direction in the direction of the action in the direction of systemic change. This is what we are doing. And it's not because we want to. It's not because we feel we should. It's because we must. As Samuel Beckett, much admired by Maya, might have said, next time we will also fail, but we will fail better. And after that time, better still. We will continue to fail better until one day it will be put in its right place and all of us can enjoy Mino Bemat Sewin, a good life together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Very detailed, and you made me think of also how 5 years ago we had to fight for Glendon to be in the name of the declaration. And so things that we take for granted now have also evolved. We'll now, it's a pleasure to welcome and introduce and see again, Amos Key Jr. Go ahead, Amos. Amos, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for listening to it. And Ian, you brought back so many memories, and I forgot a lot of that. The one that I did remember, though, that I think the second declaration was around the year for Indigenous languages. Weren't we trying to echo that as well from the United Nations declaration? With our declaration, I mean, yeah, so it was during the year of Indigenous languages that they had committed to. I'm just going to share some of my findings in the last sort of 24 hours. I just realized too that Bill is at C5 that created this this day never had the same process that we had to go through for the Bill C91. There was no standing committees that I was understanding of. All of a sudden, when they want to make laws, they forget about all of that process. And I know it was called out right after the 215 in Kamloops. That's when they moved it, and they didn't even call it an act for Truth and Reconciliation. It was buried in another bill, anyway, to acknowledge this day. So I don't know what process they're using. One day they're using another process, and another day they're using another process. So anyway, I just I wanted to share with you as in the last 48 hours, I've given about 4 talks now about truth and reconciliation and languages is going through all of that. So I just wanted to share with you some other things that we could be considering in our academic institutions. And one of them goes to, and these are points to ponder. I call them points to ponder. And I like what Senator Sinclair says, we need to arm the reasonable through the calls to action. But he also reminds Justin Trudeau that he doesn't have a work plan to respond to the calls to action. And if anyone heard Senator Sinclair in the last couple of days, he was on CBC a couple of times, and he mentions that he's had several meetings with Justin Trudeau and reminded him when Trudeau asks him, how are we doing? And that was his response. You don't have a map, a roadmap to respond to the 94 calls. Basically, you're doing dismally with responding to the 94 calls to action. So that's some of the things that I've heard in the last sort of 48 hours of where we are with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I think if Trudeau thinks that C91 is responding to the calls to action, it was done so quickly as well. I think Ian and I know, everyone knows that. They never heard any of us that went to the standing committee with suggestions and recommendations on how to improve it, including language rights. I just wanted to share also, I'm really, if we look at the national, the call to action numbers 53 to 56, that establishes the National Council on Truth and Reconciliation, I think that should be very much in the forefront if we're going to move forward in the next little while. I know they have a mandate. They set aside a budget. So I guess I got to call my local MP and ask where that is, because it has been established, and that it's a National Council on Truth and Reconciliation. I would think when I look at the mandate that they're going to look at metrics to evaluate how far along the yardstick we are with the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. So I think that's something else that we can look at as a point to ponder. The other point to ponder for me, and looking at, because this legislation took away our languages, is to conduct research in dismantling the notorious Indian Act. And I remind all of us that we are the only race in Canada that has an act to control it. That in itself needs to be addressed. There's no French act, there's no Italian act, there's no Asian act, but there is an Indian act. So I ask, what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this picture? So anyway, we need to look at doing research on dismantling the Indian Act and how can we do it? Is there a timeline? We haven't done that yet. I also ask that we might want to look at conducting research and feasibilities to create modern day written Indigenous constitutions and charters of rights and freedoms that represent all Indigenous civilizations in this country. There are 3 Indigenous civilizations in Ontario. That might be the mechanism or the model that would dismantle the Indian Act. It would give another even playing field. The other term is, in my other point to ponder, is debunking the term culture to self-identify as Indigenous people and create an educated paradigm shift that includes the term Indigenous civilizations going forward. I would argue that after contact, Indigenous civilizations suffered from an apocalypse. Nothing was the same. Yet we had all these beautiful civilizations that were social democratic civilizations, and no need for a militia or army at the point of contact. We were living in peace times within each other's Indigenous civilizations, the Muskego, the Cree, the Anishinaabe, and the Ohsweken. In fact, they had created a treaty, the dish with one spoon. And then contact happens, and then the apocalypse happens too, a social apocalypse with our Indigenous civilizations. We had all the hallmarks of any civilization in the world, including languages that sewed all the traits and customs and institutions together. We need to do that research. We need to find PhD students to verify what I'm trying to say here today as a point to ponder. We need to curate with undergrad students who are Indigenous the opportunity to become masters and PhDs. I don't think we do that very well as a track record in institutions, especially with my experience at Brock University. So we could grab a hold of this young energy and say, stay in, we need scholars, we need Indigenous scholars. So it's not by the luck of the draw, it's actually, we actually do a creative way to make sure that they stay in and be our next set of scholars. I won't see that day, but hopefully the institutions will begin to do that. And I think we need to do some research and co-create a number of new co-op, co-major experiential degrees. I offered that to Brock, and I also suggested to FNTI, where I now am a consultant. And they could be on the areas of international, Indigenous, bilingualism, and immersion education studies. It's a big ticket, but I think we need to look at that. An international Indigenous degree in spiritualities and theologies of all our Indigenous people around the world. International Indigenous philosophies, international Indigenous performing and visual arts, international Indigenous arts administration, international Indigenous psychologies, earth sciences, social sciences, health sciences. So it would come from our points of view and be informed by our civilizations. And international, we need to look at Indigenous civil service at the local level within our agencies in urban centers and on reserve, civil service within the provincial and federal government so that our people can take those places. I've done my homework and I think we only have one Indigenous ADM in Ontario at that level of the minister. The federal government, there are 2 or 3. And why I say that is from my experience being at the Trillium Foundation. I was there for 6 years, the biggest foundation in Canada, and I was the only voice among the sea of 25 other board members. And what happens is as soon as the word Aboriginal came up or Indigenous, those 25 sets of eyes look at me. I'm the only one in the room. So I'm saying we need to create a critical mass of young people that's willing to take those boardroom tables, advise government, or be in the place of government, so that we are the part of the conversation when they're creating policy. So we can tell them what might happen if they don't go that way. Anyway, I think that's something that one of our institutions can look at. Of course, political science as well, poli-sci, and the area of prophecies, international Indigenous prophecy and Genesis. I don't know I haven't read anyone who's writing about that. I know we do it individually within our own, but I think doing comparative analysis, that would be so beautiful. International prophecy and Genesis. Because we all have our own Genesis stories. Like Christianity has Adam and Eve and, all of that. We likewise have beautiful, beautiful Genesis stories. And I think that would raise the bar if, it'd be available to all students around the world to take these courses so they would understand. So anyway, those are my remarks right now. And I guess we'll have an opportunity to ask questions and make comments after Maya. Donito, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amos. Your comments and your points to ponder are great. They're very concrete. They're easily to understand and to follow. And I'm really happy that we have a chance to explore your idea of civilization, as you've been talking for many years.
Yes.
So I've taken a lot of notes, I know personally. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
We're going to turn to Maya Chacaby. Go ahead, Maya.
Ani bojo odemic Indigenous amic indodam kaministakwa nindunji no com Toronto nindigita Glendon York University nintashianoki wingi nimenwenten kaya no com. Hello everybody, greetings. My name is Maya Chacaby, although Michel and many others pronounce it in fun and interesting ways. I'm cool with that. My real name is Odemic, that's my spirit name, so I'm good with whatever you want to call me. I teach in sociology at Glendon. I'm very privileged. I feel very privileged and honored to be there. I've actually been at Glendon part-time for over, Ian, probably a decade? I don't know. It was Ian's fault that I ended up at Glendon. A true accomplice that Ian was to me by coming out to the bush and hanging out with a bunch of Anishinaabe while we were running language camps, never using his position, his title at Glendon, and then saying, hey, you should think about maybe teaching a couple classes there. And because he had done all that time in the bush with us, I felt like we had a connection to him. And so I ended up at Glendon, and from that moment have been wholeheartedly committed to working at Glendon on Indigenous language reclamation, specifically my beautiful language, Anishinaabe. I'm from just outside of Thunder Bay, and my clan is Amic and Dodam. I'm Beaver clan, so this is also part of fulfilling my responsibilities. I'm here to share with you some super fantastically exciting stuff that came to me after we did the work on the Glendon Declaration. That's the short version of the title. So this is, what is it? What did we say, 5 years later? It's 5 years later now? My math is bad. This is where I see the future of Anishinaabe, not just at Glendon, but what I'm hoping is across the world in ways that everyone can access. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Give up antenna, you all can see that? Yeah, okay, that's good. All right. So I'm going to play a real quick trailer to the future of Anishinaabe for you all. I hope that gets you excited. That is the trailer to what I've been working on for the last couple years. So what has happened with Anishinaabe as is it is steadily becoming an endangered, critically endangered language as each generation passes, without the kind of infrastructure that we need to create not just second language learners, but proficient speakers. Often what happens in low context classrooms is people learn, like my kids are at First Nation school, they learn how to count 1 to 10 and a couple colors, some nouns, and that's it. That's what counts as second language in the meager curricula that we have, which is already not very much to begin with. So I was trying to figure out how can I be part of creating a language learning community? And some of my friends from U of T are here. They know I've been doing this for a long time, trying to find all kinds of trickstery ways to make the language real and lived, no matter where we are, and make it viable. Some of the things at the very beginning that I figured out was the first thing I needed to do was move away from Western pedagogical approaches for the language and start to look at Anishinaabe pedagogy. And here's some examples of, here are sort of the 7 key foundational approaches for Anishinaabe pedagogy, teaching and learning practices. So how can I do teaching and learning in ways that truly honor this? And my friend Sarah's here from U of T. We did all kinds of ridiculous things in the world to embody Anishinaabe pedagogy, and still that wasn't enough. So then I was like, oh my goodness, okay, yeah, I accidentally became a linguist because I had to read the Western grammars that were written for the language, but none of this makes sense to my people in my communities. I can't teach them about animate and transitive verbs and inanimate and transitive verbs. It's just, all of this doesn't make sense. So I had to, in my spare time, rewrite the grammar and sit with the elders and rewrite a grammar structure that made sense through our worldview. I'm just I'm just trying to make the language happen, and this was necessary. So among a whole bunch of other things. So I rewrote the grammar to include our perspectives and our Anishinaabe understanding of the world. And so looking at the language, the grammar as a circle, I noticed that there are 4 key parts of speech. Well, heck, that makes perfect sense in my worldview, because everything, I don't know if people have seen that medicine wheel, but hey, it's got 4 quadrants, so I can work with that. 4 quadrants, we got it. Everything is alive. So I'm going to take these Western ideas of animate and inanimate out of the language and talk about Bamatase and Bamaten. You may have heard Ian talk about Mino Bamatase, the good life. So that aliveness, we're going to build that in there. And hey, once I can do that, oh my goodness, it's quite fantastic. There are 7 pronouns in the language. Oh my gosh, we have 7 grandfather teachings. That's part of our ethical and moral structures. So I can teach people about grammar using our existing teachings, the idea of a circle and the idea of 7 beings. Perfect. I can start to tell a story, and we can go through the circle and understand the language. And by the end of it, oh my goodness, check out what, after like 8 to 10 hours of language instruction, there was like massive amounts of grammar being taught all of a sudden. And still, this wasn't enough. I knew even then that access to the elders and time with in-person speakers, that's what was missing. So how do I go from this, which was already producing extremely proficient speakers in a very short amount of time, how do I go to creating a community of language learners? And then, of course, we had the pandemic. So now, how do I do this virtually? So the first thing I did before the pandemic was I created a tabletop role-playing game. That's right. I had to also, on top of all of these complex issues, I also had to think about the kind of trauma that Indigenous students were arriving with in a language learning setting. There is so much shame and self-hatred and blame and lack of self-worth that is surrounding Indigenous learners, especially when it comes to language, that I had to find a fun and interesting way to move past those traumatic experiences and those trauma reactions to a place where people would be out of their amygdala and able to learn. So I created an adventure. It was a card-based trading where you pick your own vocabulary. You can change the language, so any quote-unquote dialect, which I have problems with that term, but any learner from any community could come and learn the language regardless of the word choices, the verb, the way they spell things. It didn't matter. Great. So now I've got all this. I have a whole adventure set up about all of us going on an adventure, taking on these challenges and fighting the linguicidals. Yes. So we started this big adventure game in class, and all of a sudden people's vocabulary was starting to grow, because I was focusing on grammar before, not so much on vocabulary. So now, with their own ability to choose their own adventure, they started to pick up the vocabulary on their own without any study in between classes. It was super cool, and everything was peer-based learning, so people were supporting each other in each of the quests. And then at the end, they would have these, of course, at the beginning, there's training, just like any video game, there's training. But check it out. So they pick their cards, they would have these challenges, there would be instructions on how to do it, and then there would be a dungeon challenge, which if anybody here plays video games, big RPG type games, role-playing games, like there's always like a repetitive piece. And then there's a big boss battle. And the boss battle was my way of figuring out where the students were at, because it was all of them against me. I got to pretend to be the big boss. So every level would have this boss fight. Super, super cool. But it still wasn't enough, because then we have COVID, we have online remote learning. How am I going to take this highly interactive teaching and make it happen virtually? So then I paired up with some really, really awesome people, a game development corporation that specializes in virtual learning environments, VLEs, Nokiwan Tribal Council, which represents a very large population of Anishinaabe up in the North region, where I'm from, north of Thunder Bay, and Geeks Without Borders, which is a not-for-profit committed to providing broadband to marginalized communities. So we started to develop something really freaking cool. Here is what the virtual we're building this game now, or not this game, but the adventure. We're building it inside of a virtual world where everyone gets to create their own characters and wander through the bush up in the Lake Nipigon area. Everything that you encounter is interactable, and you start to learn as you're interacting. You learn the words because you'll be able to interact with them. The non-playable characters are actual community members from those First Nations that are part of the partnership. They're going to be in the virtual world as non-playable characters, telling stories in the language, teaching you, taking you on adventures. But this is what the actual virtual world looks like. You choose your own adventure. You choose what areas of the language you want to learn. Those are quest markers if you want to pick up a quest and go on a different quest to recover another part of the language. And like Amos said, we live in an apocalypse. We are living in a post-apocalypse now. And so we built this whole platform on the idea of a post-apocalypse where Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can come together and restore the language, fight the linguicidals. Here's a linguicidal here eating the language. The linguicidals are destroying the land and taking the magic of the language away. And so we have to use the language to defeat the linguicidals that we encounter. So here's the really cool part about this, I think. As we do this, it's a virtual world, which means Indigenous folks from these communities can log in at the same time as our students. Students over at U of T can log in. Elders from various communities can log in. And I don't know if you know what housing in the res looks like, but usually overcrowded houses. So the one computer in the house is at the kitchen table. So this young person is playing this in this virtual world where the language is happening all through the whole adventure. And Gokum, grandma, walks by and sees this young person doing stuff in Anishinaabe, and all of a sudden she wants to stay stuff and she wants to be part of it. And so now we have that in-home language transmission that's happening. And so this is what we're building right now. Oops, here's some more little peek of the in-world. Isn't it beautiful? So you can wander around. This is what Lake Nipigon looks like, and go on hunting expeditions, learn about medicinal plants, and all other aspects of the culture. There's little pop-up magical teepees that you can go into and learn our trickster stories and philosophies. And we're building a whole chapter in this. The very initial chapter is going to be around remembering our social environment. So non-Indigenous, Indigenous people actually remembering what has brought us to this situation. Often that's called in contemporary times cultural competencies. So there's a whole part of this quest that is focused on helping anyone, any educator, work with their students to really remember our relationships, our treaties, our inheritance. So this is the plan, and then once we have this done in the Lake Nipissing region, and of course with the students at Glendon and anyone else who wants to log in, we'll start to expand the map. And then we'll start to include Bawating and Sudbury and all these other Anishinaabe communities and their elders and their characters. They can develop in the game that can be there for anyone to access and tell stories with. And then, if Amos wants, we can expand the map even more. They have to do an edge of the woods ceremony, and then they can come into all of a sudden everything becomes Cayuga. The language shifts to your language, and then if we have enough support, which is what we need all of you to do, we can start to expand the map west and have the Cree languages, and on and on and on until we take over the entire world. And in this virtual platform, every endangered Indigenous language and the stories and the worldview and the language structure and the adventures can happen for any learner who wants. That's the future for me of Anishinaabe Moin. So that's my plan. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Maya. That was wonderful and so inspiring. And I think that it shows well that with your vocation, the journey through which you're going through as well, everything's possible. It is possible. And thank you so much for that. I'm now joined with the four. We're back, the four of us. We have a few minutes for questions. I just want to check with Maya, Amos, and Ian that we can go a bit after 2:30 if there are questions. Are you okay for a few more minutes? Yeah? Okay. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box, and you can indicate to whom as well. And we'll take a few questions as well. Ian and Amos, if there's anything you'd like to say as well after hearing each other, Maya included, feel free as well. I think everybody's in awe with what we just saw. Everybody's taking it in. Amos, are you?
I can share. There's a group of us, the same three and other people who are calling ourselves the language defenders, not the linguicidals. But anyway, we are trying to raise internationally the fact that Bill C-91 does not have Indigenous language rights for Indigenous peoples, unlike the Official Languages Act does for the French in Quebec. We're trying to cite and share some of that with the United Nations portion on human rights to try to make a petition to them. And Ian can help me with this part. So we sent we hired a lawyer volunteered with us to create the document, to bring that to the attention of the United Nations. At first glance, they returned it back to us and asked us to consider exhausting, I guess is the word they used, Ian, exhausting all of the protocols within the country first, within Canada. And then if we get no resolve from that, then resubmit it to the United Nations, and then they can help us address it. Did I get that kind of summarized right, Ian? And Maya?
Yes, that's right. They said that we have to exhaust domestic remedies.
Remedies, that's right.
And it's not clear what those remedies are. The one remedy that we imagined they could mean was, as I mentioned in my talk, taking the UNDRIP law and making sure that the Indigenous language rights are coded into Canadian law, brought in from UNDRIP. And so there's a 2-year window for that to happen. And that's what I said, we have to focus on that.
And what really hits home for me is that with not having language rights within the bill of C-91 is that as Indigenous people, as you know, probably Maya must see this all the time, the number of Indigenous people migrating even to Toronto at this point, that population in Toronto could not require or request even an immersion bilingual school system or charter school in Toronto. But Francophone families have that privilege based on the Official Languages Act. Do I got that right, Ian? I think that's what I understand it to be, that right doesn't exist. So, for instance, there could be a charter school or in Toronto from K to 12 or K to 8 at least, teaching, instructing in Anishinaabe. But this act does not allow us, or Haudenosaunee languages even, to be taught off territory. So that's some of the weaknesses that we see in Bill C-91. And I just go from the story that Ian told me about our Francophone brothers and sisters demanding a school in Nunavut, and it was built within years for a small number of students because the rights were included in the Official Languages Act, that the government must operate or must build a school for the Francophone brothers and sisters off territory, off Quebec. So that's one of the what hits home for me, and it's only because we're more and more of us are moving to the urban centers. Our communities are on territory. There's not enough territory, especially for Six Nations, for instance. We don't have.
Could I interject?
Yes, sorry.
Sorry, it's Stephen Barry here. You're quite right about Ontario only providing, in general terms, English language or French language education, but there's a very little known provision for transitional bilingual education. But on the request of communities, and as far as I know, it's only been granted in Ontario so far to Arabic community in Windsor and to Chinese community in Welland. It seems not to be known in Toronto, and I don't know whether you might have any luck proposing not K to 12, but K to 3 or maybe K to 6 bilingual education program. Ian, have you heard anything about people trying this in Toronto?
No, and I've only heard it from you, but Steve. But you're
well,
absolutely
Jim
right.
Cummins' group did an evaluation of the Chinese English program, which somehow was somewhere in Niagara. And there was a woman in the Ministry of Education at a session at Ohsweken a couple of years ago talking about this provision. And I asked, how is it that Arabic English exists in Windsor? And she said, well, I'm from Windsor. So the local community spoke to her and then she stick-handled it through somehow. I don't know if it's a general policy, but there's the precedent of 2 communities have been served. There may be more that I don't know of. But it would still be, on the argument that it is to ease the transition to English. That's the logic of it. And that's where the language policy at the federal level kind of falls flat because it's provincial education policy sometimes that is the key one we need to change. But I can get that name. It's I don't recall her name right now, and she may be retired, but there is a person who was in the ministry who could provide some information.
Very good.
Great.
Thank you very much for that.
Oh, sorry.
I am going to, Amos, did you want, or Ian or Maya, did you want to chime in? Anything else that comes to mind?
Well, you might have to have another declaration, another colloquium at York for the next steps.
I'm happy to report that Ian and I have been in contact and the Robarts Center will support whatever you have in mind.
Okay.
So we are going to put that a part of our responsibility to support what you have in mind.
Yeah. I like the notions of declarations. It kind of gives you a step to build. So, and at least as a historic record as well on the evolution of these rights. So
we got a lot of mileage out of our declaration.
Yes, I agree.
Well, I think I'm gonna end on that, unless there's any final thoughts from our speakers.
Well, thank you very much to Sylvie for hosting this, to Jean-Michel for moderating. It's lovely to see the four of us together. We had such a surprisingly successful time 5 years ago, and it's wonderful to see that we're still alive and fighting for the same values that we had then.
Yes. I hate some hand het hen honyo gang hede hanagri so guaya diso sen scanner de dwayo nanto hone nandi Zoom meeting. Zoom what kanisa se iso di dagadan honyo hani. Sani yantre sani johnson sani gawa no dane jungwe home and ni Anishinaabe. I just like to thank my colleagues here and all of you for listening and listening to us and sing our song about our own languages, Anishinaabe and my language, So I just want to thank you all for listening to. It's a long journey that we had to get on, and I'm so glad York, we found a home in York to help us kind of draft those, this epiphany of conscience, I guess, in regarding our language rights and our journey on languages. So I just like to thank York for that and all your colleagues there with Ian and Maya. It's been a great journey, and I hope I can see the day when we do have a charter school for Haudenosaunee languages and Anishinaabe in Toronto. Yay! Yes.
Thank you. Before I turn to Sylvie for the final word, Maya, would you like to say something? Or if not, I'm so happy to see you and to learn everything that you're doing.
That's fantastic, Maya.
So Sylvie, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to thank you for this wonderful afternoon. It was, you said, and Maya, I'm very, very impressed, just like everybody else. We really have to try and help you, and we'll see what CRLCC can do to try and help you build this wonderful tool. I also wanted to tell everyone that this is not it for us for this week. Well, actually, it'll be next week, but on the 7th, we'll be talking about language ecology and Indigenous languages and Indigenous peoples again at CRLCC. It'll be at 12 on Thursday, and Sean Medes will be talking about Mohawk, Indigenous peoples and language during early Canadian settler state formation. So please join us next week for this other fascinating talk, I'm sure. Just for the people who were asking, I just wanted to remind you that all the documents that were referred to are on the CRLCC website. So please go read. We have translations in different languages for that declaration, so please go ahead. And thank you very much. Thank you, Jean-Michel, for your wonderful job as usual. You're just a natural. Merci, and thank you thank you, Priska, also for being there all the time to make sure everything works. So merci à tous, and let's make sure that we have something like this next year with maybe better news.
Yes.
Merci. Thank you very much. Merci.
Ona.
Au revoir. Thank you.
Ona.